When Ethan Carter accepted the proposal to map the Amarna forest, he thought it would be just another challenging job in his long career as a geographer. Ethan had faced treacherous mountains and scorching deserts before, but this hidden forest in an obscure corner of the map felt different. The organization that hired him had sent a team of explorers before, but none of them returned with any useful information. "It's uncharted territory, but we'll reward your courage generously," they said. The promise of wealth, combined with his professional curiosity, was enough to convince him to embark on the journey. The trip to the location was long and tedious, taking him over dirt roads and through villages that seemed frozen in time. Ethan stared out of the Jeep's window as dense forests loomed on the horizon, an impenetrable wall of green that almost seemed alive. The local guide, a quiet man named Richard, abruptly stopped the vehicle at the edge of a narrow trail. "This is as far as I go." "Good luck," he said, handing Ethan his backpack and gesturing toward the trail as if it had secrets he preferred to avoid. Ethan didn't hesitate. He adjusted his backpack and checked his equipment before stepping into the forest, feeling the air shift as soon as he crossed the tree line. It was as if time and space themselves transformed within the woods. The trees were so dense they nearly blocked out the sunlight, and the sound of birds and insects felt muffled, as though something invisible was observing his every move. He had a meticulous plan. He would follow a straight path, relying on his GPS and compass to stay on course, collecting data and documenting the terrain. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. Ethan mapped the landscape, noted the tree species, and documented the local wildlife, which seemed unusually silent at night. He noticed that his compass occasionally wavered erratically but attributed it to potential magnetic deposits in the area. On the 3rd day, however, something started to change. Ethan realized that the forest seemed to repeat itself. Fallen trees he'd marked reappeared in locations that didn't make sense. He tried retracing his steps but always ended up at unfamiliar points. His GPS began to fail, showing inconsistent positions that left him increasingly frustrated. By the end of the 4th day, while taking notes near a small stream, Ethan heard a sound that didn't belong to the forest. It was a whisper, low and indistinct, seeming to come from every direction at once. He stood up, gripping the machete he used to clear his path, and turned slowly in a circle, trying to identify the source. There was no one there. He tried to shake off the discomfort, but the whisper seemed to follow him, as if something unseen was always lurking nearby. The next morning, he decided to push deeper into the forest. If something was wrong with the area, he needed to find out why. Then, after crossing a mist-covered clearing, Ethan saw something that made his heart race. Ahead of him, hidden by the tree's veil, was an entire city. The structures were made of stone and wood, covered in moss and vines, as though nature itself had tried to conceal them. Spires with pointed roofs rose above the canopy, and small, crumbling buildings lined cobblestone streets. It was as if he had stumbled upon a lost fragment of history. Ethan approached cautiously, examining every detail. It wasn't uncommon for ancient cities to be swallowed by the forest, but this one felt different. It wasn't a forgotten ruin, there were signs of life. Clothes hung out to dry, smoke drifted from chimneys, and the distant sound of children laughing echoed through the streets. He passed through what appeared to be the main entrance, an arch carved with symbols he didn't recognize, and felt a chill run down his spine. Something was profoundly wrong here. He walked through the narrow streets, observing the residents who seemed oblivious to his presence. They were ordinary people, dressed in outdated clothing, continuing their daily tasks without paying him much attention. Ethan tried speaking to a man carrying a basket of fruit, but the man only nodded briefly before continuing on his way. The few words he exchanged with other residents were vague and confusing. When he asked where he was, the most common response was, "You already know." By the end of the day, exhausted and frustrated, Ethan tried to leave the city. He followed the same trail he had taken to enter, marking his path with ribbons tied to low-hanging branches. However, after walking for hours, he realized something was terribly wrong. He ended up back at the same arch he had left behind, as if the city refused to let him go. He tried again, this time running down a different path, but the result was the same. The city wrapped around him, trapping him in a maze that seemed alive. As night fell, Ethan sat on a stone bench in the central square, staring up at the dark sky and the faint stars flickering above the trees. He didn't understand how or why this was happening, but one thing was certain: he was no longer in control. The whisper he'd heard before returned, louder this time, as though the city itself was calling his name. Ethan woke to the faint rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. He didn't remember when he had fallen asleep, but the discomfort of spending the night on the cold stone bench left his body stiff and aching. The square where he sat was eerily silent, almost unnaturally so. The typical sounds of the forest had vanished, replaced by a stillness that weighed on the air like a heavy shroud. Ethan glanced around, trying to organize his thoughts. The buildings around him seemed more familiar than they should, as if he had been there before. Rising brought a mix of determination and confusion. He needed to understand where he was and, more importantly, why he couldn't leave. The streets were deserted at this hour, with only the distant echoes of footsteps breaking the silence. He decided to explore the city more thoroughly, paying attention to the details he'd missed the day before. The buildings, constructed from aged stone and weathered wood, had something peculiar about them. Every door looked exactly the same, adorned with intricate geometric carvings. The windows were small, some covered with tattered curtains that obscured any view of the interiors. Walking slowly, Ethan came across what appeared to be a small marketplace. Unlike the empty streets, this area was bustling with activity. People moved between stalls filled with fruits and handcrafted goods. He watched their faces as he passed, hoping to catch something that revealed more about them, but their expressions were vacant. No one seemed surprised or uncomfortable with his presence. He tried again to ask questions. He approached a vendor and asked where he was, but the man only smiled faintly and replied, "The same place as always." These vague answers were beginning to gnaw at Ethan's patience. He walked away from the market, feeling the eyes of a few people following him, though they never looked directly at him. The sensation of being watched, of being an outsider in a place where everyone seemed to know something he didn't, was suffocating. He decided to return to the city's entrance and attempt to trace his path again, but when he reached the stone archway, the same shiver ran down his spine. It felt like an invisible barrier he couldn't cross, as if something was pulling him back. As the day wore on, Ethan began to notice other details. The children playing in the streets always seemed to be in the same spots, repeating the same motions. A blonde-haired girl chased after a red ball but always stopped just before catching it, only to start the motion again. He passed her 3 times at different moments, but the scene was identical each time. He tried speaking to her, but the girl only glanced at him briefly before returning to her endless game. The city felt like a facade, as if everything was carefully orchestrated to maintain an illusion of normalcy. Ethan entered a small building that appeared to be a library. Inside, the shelves were filled with old books bound in leather, their pages yellowed with age. He pulled one out and noticed something unsettling: every page was blank. Each book he examined was the same: no words, no stories, just empty shells that mimicked what they were supposed to be. At the back of the library, he found an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair, staring out a window overlooking the square. She seemed to be the only person there with a different look in her eyes, more attentive, more aware. Ethan hesitated before approaching her but decided to take the risk. "Do you know what this place is?" he asked. The woman slowly turned her head toward him, a tired smile forming on her lips. "They're watching," she said softly before standing and walking away, leaving him alone. Those words echoed in Ethan's mind as he continued his exploration. Who were they? Were they the city's inhabitants, or was it something bigger? He started paying closer attention to the symbols carved into the walls and columns of the buildings. They seemed to follow specific patterns, always forming shapes that resembled a stylized eye. The more he observed, the more he realized these markings were everywhere, almost like a hidden signature. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to the central square. He needed a strategy, a plan to help him escape. Sitting on a stone bench, he began sketching in his notebook, trying to map the city. It was something automatic for him, a way to impose order on chaos. However, as he drew, he noticed something strange. The paths he marked on the map always connected in a circular pattern, leading him back to the same point. No matter how he tried to rearrange the lines, the result was the same. Frustration turned into a deeper unease. He felt someone watching him and looked up. Across the square stood a man, tall and dark-haired, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. The man was motionless, observing Ethan intently. When Ethan stood to confront him, the man turned and disappeared into one of the alleys. Ethan ran after him, but when he turned the corner, there was no one there. It was as if he had vanished. Later, as the sun disappeared behind the trees and night enveloped the city, Ethan felt an overwhelming fatigue. He knew something was wrong with this place, but he didn't have the tools to understand what. He lay back down on the bench in the square, keeping his machete close, and tried to convince himself it was only a matter of time before he found a way out. However, the weight of so many unanswered questions began to suffocate him. The silence of the city at night was even more unsettling than during the day. There was no wind, no sound of animals. Only the sound of his own breathing echoed among the buildings. As he closed his eyes, he heard the whisper again, louder now, almost as if it was forming words. "Remember who you are." The night brought an increasing restlessness. Ethan couldn't sleep. That whisper, distant yet constant, seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He sat on the bench, clutching the machete in one hand and his notebook in the other, as if these objects were his only tether to reality. The central square seemed larger at night, and the shadows cast by the surrounding buildings gave the impression that the space was alive. He looked up at the sky, but the stars seemed unfamiliar. He couldn't recognize a single constellation, as though this place existed in a world apart. When morning came, the silence was replaced by a strange routine. The residents began to emerge from their homes and move through the square, but something about their movements felt deeply wrong. They walked slowly, with calculated gestures, as if following an invisible choreography. Ethan watched, fascinated and suspicious, trying to detect patterns that might make sense. He wondered if this was some kind of performance, but if it was, he couldn't understand its purpose. He decided to follow a few of the people discreetly, hoping to find clues about how the city operated. Trailing a woman carrying a basket of fruit, Ethan arrived at a small market located at the intersection of two narrow streets. He noticed that the items for sale appeared identical to those in the marketplace from the day before: fruits, bread, and simple tools. However, no one was actually buying anything. People merely walked between the stalls, picked up objects, examined them for a few seconds, and then returned them to the exact same spot, repeating the cycle with mechanical precision. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized no one was speaking. When he tried to approach one of the residents, a man in tattered clothes and a worn hat, he received the same vague response he'd heard before: "You already know." Ethan began to wonder if these people were real or if they were part of some collective hallucination. He left the market and made his way to one of the less frequented streets, where the houses looked more dilapidated. Here, the atmosphere was even darker, and the silence almost tangible. Exploring one of the abandoned houses, Ethan found signs of an old life: furniture covered in dust, black and white portraits hanging on cracked walls, and a pendulum clock frozen at 3 o'clock. Yet, there was something unsettling about it. He noticed that all the portraits featured the same faces he had seen in the city. Not similar faces, but exactly the same residents walking the streets. It was as if time itself had stopped in this place. In one of the drawers of a decaying desk, Ethan found a piece of paper with symbols that he recognized from the city's arches and walls. The geometric patterns were drawn with precision, but there was also text written beneath them in a language he didn't understand. He took a photo of it with his phone, even though he had no way to analyze it at the moment. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket before continuing his search. As he explored further, he heard the whisper again, the one that had followed him since entering the city. This time, it was stronger and seemed to be coming from upstairs. Ethan climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under his weight. The sensation of being watched was nearly unbearable. When he reached the top floor, he found a small, empty room with a single chair in the center. On the chair rested an antique pocket watch, open and ticking at the same 3 o'clock as the pendulum clock below. He picked it up, but as soon as he did, the whisper abruptly stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier. He returned to the square, trying to organize his thoughts. The clues didn't connect, but everything pointed to the idea that the city was more than just a forgotten place. There was something deliberate in its construction, something that seemed to control every detail. He began to pay closer attention to the residents, noting how their actions seemed synchronized. They walked the streets with slow, precise steps, as if following an unseen script. When he tried to look away, he felt as though something always pulled his gaze back toward them. That afternoon, Ethan noticed a figure that stood out. It was a tall man with dark hair, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, standing in front of one of the city's taller buildings. The man was motionless, observing the square, but he didn't interact with anyone. When Ethan tried to approach him, the man turned and walked into the building. Ethan followed, a sense of urgency driving him forward. The interior of the building was cold and dimly lit. The walls were covered with the same symbols Ethan had seen elsewhere, but here they glowed faintly, as if recently engraved. The man disappeared down a hallway, and Ethan hurried after him, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, distorting as though he were inside a labyrinth. Finally, Ethan reached a room where the man was seated, staring at a wall covered in symbols. Before Ethan could speak, the man stood and turned to face him. His gaze was sharp, almost paralyzing. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his deep voice echoing in the room. Ethan tried to ask what that meant, but the man only repeated, "They're watching you," before disappearing like a shadow. When Ethan exited the building, he felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew the city held deep secrets, but he also realized he was being manipulated. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step, and he began to notice hidden cameras embedded in the carvings on walls and columns. They weren't modern cameras but rudimentary devices, almost imperceptible, that seemed to blend seamlessly with the architecture. That night, Ethan returned to the central square and tried to sleep again. This time, however, he had a goal. He knew he needed to understand the symbols and decipher the patterns that governed this place. As he closed his eyes, the whisper returned, louder than ever, and this time it seemed to form words. "Remember who you are." The weight of the notebook seemed to double in Ethan's hands as he walked through the silent streets of the city. Those words from the night before, "Remember who you are," echoed in his mind like a relentless refrain. He wrote them down in his notebook alongside a mess of disconnected sketches of the city and the symbols that seemed to appear everywhere. Something deep inside him told him these carvings weren't random. They were part of a hidden language, a code he needed to break. He spent the morning revisiting places he had already explored, searching for patterns he might have missed. That was when he found something different. As he walked along a less frequented alley, he noticed a building that stood out from the others. It was larger and more modern, with cracked concrete walls that contrasted sharply with the city's predominantly aged architecture. It seemed out of place, but at the same time, it blended into the environment like it was trying too hard to belong. When he entered, Ethan was greeted by the smell of mildew and an oppressive silence. The interior walls were marked with the same symbols he had seen in the city, but here they were more detailed. They covered nearly every surface, from columns to the ceiling. The building looked like it had been abandoned for decades. He walked cautiously through the corridors, stepping over shards of glass and rotting wood, until he found a partially open door leading to a smaller room. Inside, on a splintered wooden table, was a book. Ethan approached carefully, picking up the book as if it were a priceless artifact. It was a journal, bound in worn leather, with pages yellowed by time. He opened the first page and froze. The handwriting was identical to his own. The entries began simply, like an exploration log. They described the first days in the city, the difficulty in understanding its residents, and the strangeness of the symbols. But as he flipped through, the words became more fragmented, almost desperate, as though the author were fighting against something invisible. The city is a cycle. Every path leads back to the same place, read one entry, underlined several times. Another note declared, the symbols are the key, but I can't decipher them. My mind is no longer my own. Ethan felt a chill as he read those words. It was as if someone, himself, had already been through all this and was trying to leave a trail for the future. As he read, flashes of memory began to surface in his mind. He saw disconnected images, a laboratory with bright lights, expressionless faces watching him from behind glass, and deep voices discussing something called neural control. He closed his eyes, trying to hold onto these fragments before they disappeared, but they slipped away like smoke. He looked back at the journal and turned to a page that seemed more worn than the others. At the top, a phrase was scrawled in large letters, "If you found this journal, it means you've already failed." Ethan felt the weight of those words hit him like a blow. He stepped back from the table, his heart racing. What did this mean? How could someone predict his presence there, write such specific entries, and worse, in his own handwriting? Was he trapped in some kind of endless loop? He tried to recall how he had arrived in the forest, but his memory was a haze. He couldn't remember key details, like the exact purpose of his mission or who had hired him. It was as if his mind was being erased and reconstructed over and over. Determined to understand more, Ethan flipped through the remaining pages of the journal. There were hand-drawn maps that seemed to detail the city, but none showed a clear way out. On one of the final pages, he found something different, a rudimentary sketch of a device with symbols similar to those in the city. Beneath it, a note read, "The heart is buried. Find it and free yourself." The heart. Ethan knew this was important, but he had no idea what it meant. He left the building, clutching the journal tightly, determined to find more answers. As he walked through the streets, he noticed the residents had started acting differently. They seemed more aware, as though they knew he had discovered something. He saw groups of people gathering, whispering among themselves while casting sidelong glances in his direction. The unease grew with every step, but he pressed on. He returned to the central square and sat on a bench, opening the journal again. This time, he focused on the maps. There was a specific mark in the center of the city, a point highlighted with the symbol he had been seeing everywhere. Following the directions, he found himself standing in front of a structure that resembled a temple, with massive columns and an ornate double door. The building radiated a sense of power, as though it were the city's nerve center. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The walls were covered in symbols that glowed faintly, almost as if they were alive. At the center of the main hall was a stone pedestal, empty but etched with markings that matched the device sketched in the journal. Ethan examined the pedestal closely, running his fingers over the carvings. Though he couldn't understand their exact meaning, there was a clear pattern. They connected like a map or circuit. As he studied it, flashes of memory returned once more. This time, they were clearer. He saw himself standing in front of the same pedestal, but surrounded by other men and women dressed in white. He heard voices urgently discussing things like frequencies, neural control, and reset protocols. He staggered back from the pedestal, breathing heavily. The déjà vu was so intense it made his stomach churn. Ethan knew he needed to figure out more. He decided to return to the abandoned building where he had found the journal, hoping something else was hidden there. The walk back was tense. The sound of the residents' footsteps, usually calm, now echoed with more intensity, as if they were following him at a distance. Ethan turned a corner quickly and caught a glimpse of a small figure disappearing behind a wall. It wasn't the first time he felt like someone was actively watching him, but now it felt more deliberate, more threatening. Back in the building, Ethan searched the corridors with renewed focus. He found a different room, its entrance sealed by a rusted iron door. Forcing it open with his machete, he stepped into a dark space illuminated only by the flashlight on his phone. Inside was a table covered with papers and drawings. They looked like technical diagrams, showing details of machines Ethan didn't recognize. In the center of the table, he found another familiar note: the cycle repeats. Every attempt ends in a reset. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. If this was true, if he was really trapped in a cycle, how could he break it? As he rifled through the papers, he found a hand-drawn map that showed the city, and something else. Beneath the temple, there was a tunnel marked with a faint line leading to its center. This was new. Ethan realized the map hadn't been in the original journal he found earlier. It was a clue, perhaps one revealed only in the specific attempt, whatever that meant. He tucked the map away, feeling a surge of hope. If the tunnel existed, it might be a way to access the heart without interference from the residents or the man in the suit. The weight of the journal seemed to increase with every step Ethan took through the city's shadowed streets. Those words, "the cycle repeats. Every attempt ends in a reset," echoed endlessly in his mind. He tried to push them away, but they lingered, gnawing at his thoughts. How could someone have written such a thing? How could they have anticipated his exact situation? Worse, how could it be in his own handwriting? As he flipped through the pages again, the fragmented notes and cryptic maps only deepened his frustration. The city's residents seemed to be moving differently now. It wasn't just the strange, repetitive habits or synchronized behavior. They now moved with a purpose. Their steps seemed deliberate, their paths intersecting as though they were following a hidden rhythm. Ethan felt a cold sweat as he realized that no matter where he went, at least one pair of eyes was always on him. He clutched the map he'd found in the abandoned building. If the tunnel beneath the temple existed, it might be his best hope. By the time he reached the temple, the massive structure loomed even more ominously in the daylight. The entrance, which had seemed to hum with energy the night before, was now silent, almost waiting for him. Ethan stepped inside, retracing his path to the central hall where the empty pedestal sat. The carvings on its surface still glowed faintly, as though alive, and he ran his fingers over them once more. The symbols formed intricate patterns that almost seemed to shift under his touch, like they were guiding him. As he focused on the pedestal, another wave of memories struck him. This time, they were sharper. He saw himself standing in this very room, surrounded by others. The voices echoed clearly now. "Neural frequencies must remain stable," one said. "The system can't tolerate anomalies." He saw himself shouting, his face twisted in frustration. "This isn't right," he had said, before the memory dissolved. Ethan staggered backward, the weight of the revelations nearly overwhelming him. "The cycle isn't just the city," he murmured to himself. "It's me." Determined to find the tunnel, Ethan followed the map's directions. He exited the temple and made his way to the central square, where the map indicated an entrance hidden beneath the ground. After carefully searching, he found it, a small hatch concealed by a thin layer of dirt and moss. He pried it open, the creak of wood and metal breaking the heavy silence. Below was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The faint glow of the symbols reflected in the damp stone walls as he began his descent. The tunnel was long and winding, the air thick and cool. The same geometric patterns that decorated the city were etched into the walls here, but they seemed more vibrant, as though they pulsed with energy. The faint hum that had accompanied him since entering the city grew louder, more insistent. Ethan couldn't tell how long he'd been walking, but eventually, the tunnel opened into a large, circular chamber. At the center of the chamber stood a machine unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was a strange blend of metal and organic shapes, pulsating with a faint blue light. It reminded him of a beating heart, alive and aware of his presence. He approached cautiously, the sound of his own footsteps drowned out by the rhythmic hum. This had to be the heart mentioned in the journal. As he moved closer, he saw more symbols etched into the surface of the machine, forming what looked like a control panel. He hesitated before touching it, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the cool metal. The moment his skin made contact, the machine reacted, emitting a low vibration that coursed through his entire body. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and a voice cut through the noise. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan spun around, his heart racing. At the entrance of the chamber stood the man in the suit, his face as expressionless as ever. "You're wasting your time," the man said, stepping forward. "Every path leads to the same place. You can't escape." Ethan's grip tightened on the journal. "You don't want me to escape," he shot back. "That's why you're here." "But I've come farther than before, haven't I?" "That's why you're worried." For the first time, the man's composure wavered. He paused, his head tilting slightly as though considering Ethan's words. "Farther doesn't mean free," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Even if you reach the end, you'll only start again." Ethan shook his head. "You're lying. I've seen it. This machine, it's the key. The heart is what keeps this cycle alive, and if I stop it..." "You stop yourself," the man interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't you see? The cycle doesn't depend on the heart. It depends on you. Every choice you make reinforces the prison. You're not escaping. You're just feeding the system." Ethan froze, his mind racing. Could that be true? Was the cycle not something imposed on him but something he was perpetuating? He thought of the journal, the maps, the fragmented memories, all clues left behind by someone who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. But if the cycle depended on him, then breaking it meant. The machine let out a loud, piercing sound, pulling Ethan back to the moment. The man stepped closer. "You think you're in control now," he said. "But you're just repeating a different part of the pattern. You can't win, Ethan. The system is too big, too intricate for you to unravel." Ethan ignored him, turning back to the machine. He didn't know how to operate it, but instinct took over. He began pressing symbols, aligning them in the patterns he'd seen throughout the city. The machine responded, its pulsating light intensifying with each adjustment. The man's calm demeanor cracked. "Stop," he barked, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. "If you continue, you'll destroy everything, including yourself." Ethan hesitated for a moment, the man's words echoing in his mind. But then he remembered the journal, "The heart is buried. Find it and free yourself." If this was the key, he couldn't stop now. With a deep breath, Ethan pressed the final symbol. The machine erupted in a blinding light, the chamber trembling violently. The man shouted something, but Ethan couldn't hear him over the deafening roar. And then, everything went silent. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor. The hatch, the tunnel, the machine, everything was gone. The air was crisp, the sky clear. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. But as he stood, brushing dirt from his clothes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the man in the suit while trying to steady his breathing. The chamber seemed to pulse in sync with the machine at its center, its rhythmic vibrations reminiscent of a beating heart. The man stood motionless, his presence filling the room like a shadow that stretched far beyond his physical form. "You can feel it, can't you?" the man said, his deep voice reverberating. "The resistance. The machine doesn't want you to touch it." Ethan didn't respond. He knew there wasn't time for words. Instead, he took a step toward the machine. The moment his hand grazed its metallic surface, a jolt of energy shot through him. A flood of images overwhelmed his mind, flashes of places and moments he couldn't remember experiencing but somehow knew were his. He saw a bright, sterile laboratory filled with rows of machines similar to the one in front of him. People in white coats moved purposefully, some jotting notes while others adjusted wires attached to motionless figures in chairs. And there he was, standing among them, giving instructions. "Neural control," he muttered under his breath, not realizing he'd spoken aloud. The man in the suit smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "Now you're starting to remember. Now you understand why you're here." Ethan took a step back, his confusion quickly morphing into panic. The fragmented memories kept coming, heated arguments with other scientists, glimpses of charts and diagrams, and his own voice, angry and desperate. "We can't keep doing this. It's wrong," he had shouted. He remembered the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, before everything went dark. "You were part of it," the man continued, stepping closer now. "But you couldn't follow the rules. You tried to expose us. And now, you're a prisoner of the very world you helped create." Ethan's head swam with conflicting thoughts. Could it be true? Had he been one of them? Part of the secretive society that built this place? The idea was impossible to grasp, yet the memories, those fragmented, undeniable memories, seemed to corroborate the man's words. The machine emitted a louder hum, snapping Ethan out of his spiraling thoughts. He refocused, knowing that the answers he needed lay within the machine. It wasn't about who he had been, it was about what he could do now. He ignored the man's gaze and began searching for a way to activate the device. The surface was covered in buttons and levers, each marked with symbols he didn't fully understand. But something inside him stirred, a faint intuition guiding his hands. "You can't win," the man said, now standing at the edge of the chamber. "Every attempt ends the same way. You think you're breaking free, but all you're doing is resetting the game." Ethan gritted his teeth. Deep down, he knew there was truth to the man's words. The journal's cryptic notes, the flashes of déjà vu, they all pointed to a cycle he couldn't escape. But this time felt different. He had come farther, remembered more, and felt closer to the answers than ever before. Suddenly, the machine began to respond. Its pulsating light grew brighter, and the hum turned into a sharp, rhythmic beat. The man in the suit took a step back, his expression finally betraying a hint of unease. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice louder now. Ethan didn't answer. His hands moved instinctively across the panel, pressing symbols and aligning patterns. As the machine's vibrations intensified, Ethan felt another wave of memories surge. This time, they were clearer. He saw himself arguing with a group of people in a dimly lit room. "This isn't about control, it's about freedom," he had shouted. He saw the moment he decided to turn against the organization, the moment he became a threat to their carefully constructed plans. "You tried before," the man said, as if reading Ethan's mind. "And you failed. That's why you're here, Ethan. Not to win, but to remind yourself that you can't." Ethan's hands hesitated for a fraction of a second. The man's words struck a nerve, echoing the doubt that had plagued him since the beginning. But then he remembered the journal, the note that had driven him this far: "The heart is buried. Find it and free yourself." He had come too far to stop now. He pressed the final symbol on the panel. The machine let out a deafening roar, its pulsating light exploding into a blinding white glow. Ethan shielded his eyes, the vibrations shaking the chamber to its core. He heard the man shout something, but the words were drowned out by the noise. When the light faded, Ethan found himself somewhere else entirely. He was standing in a long, sterile corridor with walls of white metal and fluorescent lights humming overhead. The air was cold, sterile, and clinical. It was a place he recognized immediately, the laboratory from his memories. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with doors that looked identical. Through one of them, he saw a room filled with monitors displaying live footage of the city. The streets, the square, the temple, it was all there, as if being observed from afar. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized what this meant. The city wasn't real. It was a construct, a mental prison designed to trap him. Every time he tried to escape, his mind was wiped and reset, sending him back to the beginning. The symbols, the whispers, even the journal, they were breadcrumbs left by himself in previous cycles. Inside another room, Ethan found something even more disturbing: a large chair with restraints, surrounded by machines covered in wires and screens. He touched the armrest, and another memory surfaced, this time of himself strapped to that same chair, electrodes attached to his head as voices argued in the background. "This will erase him completely," one had said. Ethan staggered back, his breathing heavy. He understood now. The cycle wasn't just a punishment, it was a tool, a way to control him, to strip him of his autonomy and ensure he could never escape. Determined to end it once and for all, Ethan pushed further into the laboratory. He found a central control room filled with consoles and monitors. On one of the screens, he saw himself standing in the machine's chamber, pressing the symbols. It was live footage, looping endlessly. Another screen showed the city resetting, its residents returning to their mechanical routines. He scanned the control panel until he found a message flashing on one of the consoles: "Do you wish to deactivate the cycle?" Beneath it were two options: yes and no. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before pressing yes. The room filled with alarms as red lights flashed overhead. He heard footsteps approaching rapidly from behind but didn't turn around. The monitors began to glitch, the images of the city breaking into static. He ran, following a glowing exit sign down another corridor. The footsteps grew louder, but he didn't look back. Pushing through the final door, he burst into the open air. The forest was silent. The sky was clear, and the air felt fresh against his skin. For the first time, he felt truly awake. But as he looked around, something felt off. The crisp air of the forest enveloped Ethan like a shock. Freedom seemed so close, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly free. Although he had escaped the laboratory, the sensation of being watched clung to him. The forest, silent and dense as ever, felt like it was alive, breathing in rhythm with his thoughts. Every step felt heavy, as though the ground beneath him resisted his movement. He walked for what felt like hours, though it was impossible to tell how much time had passed. The trees were endless, forming tunnels of shadow that twisted unnaturally. Ethan tried to rely on the fragments of memory he had regained to guide him, but they were chaotic and incomplete. He knew the laboratory and the city were connected, but the logic of the cycle still eluded him. If he had truly broken the loop, why did the forest still feel so oppressive? Then, he heard it again, footsteps. These weren't the sounds of wildlife or the rustling of leaves, they were deliberate, human. Ethan ducked behind a thick tree trunk, clutching his machete tightly, his breath shallow. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was broken by a voice he recognized instantly. "Do you really think you've escaped?" Ethan stepped out from behind the tree, his heart pounding. The man in the suit stood a few meters away, perfectly composed. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed a quiet intensity. Ethan clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the machete. "I broke the cycle," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the growing frustration in his chest. "You can't force me to go back." The man smiled, a faint, knowing smirk. "You think you've broken it?" "No, Ethan. You've just moved to another layer. Every choice you make, every step you take, is part of the system." Ethan refused to believe it. He shook his head, refusing to let the man's words take root in his mind. He'd come too far, seen too much. He couldn't go back. "If that's true," he said, narrowing his eyes, "then why are you here? If I'm just playing into the system, why do you need to stop me?" The man tilted his head slightly, his smirk fading. For the first time, he seemed almost unsure. Ethan seized on the moment, sensing a crack in his opponent's confidence. Without warning, Ethan turned and bolted, his feet pounding against the forest floor. Branches scratched at his arms and face as he ran, the sound of his footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. He didn't look back, but he could feel the man's presence pursuing him, a weight that grew heavier with every step. Finally, the trees opened into a clearing. At its center stood a large stone structure, partially covered in moss and carved with the same symbols Ethan had seen throughout the city. The air around it pulsed faintly, as if the stone was alive. Ethan slowed, his chest heaving as he approached cautiously. The carvings on the stone glowed faintly in the dim light, their patterns shifting as if responding to his presence. It felt like he had seen this before, though he couldn't place where or when. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface. Instantly, another wave of memories flooded his mind, clearer this time. He saw himself in the laboratory, standing before a group of monitors showing images of the city. He remembered yelling at someone, his voice shaking with anger. "You're not saving them, you're trapping them." Ethan pulled his hand back, his breaths coming faster. The memories were relentless now, crashing over him like waves. The stone, the city, the machine, they were all connected, part of a system far more intricate than he'd realized. The carvings on the stone began to shift, aligning into a pattern that reminded Ethan of the diagrams in the journal. He reached into his pack and pulled it out, flipping through its pages until he found what he was looking for, a sketch of the stone with instructions scrawled beneath it. "Align the symbols. Break the cycle." Ethan's hands trembled as he worked to match the symbols on the stone with the ones in the journal. The carvings seemed to resist at first, but gradually, they began to move, glowing brighter with each adjustment. The air grew thick, vibrating with an energy that pressed against his skin. "Stop!" The voice cut through the clearing like a blade. Ethan turned to see the man in the suit standing at the edge, his calm demeanor gone. "You don't understand what you're doing," the man said, his voice tight with urgency. "If you activate that, you'll destroy everything, including yourself." Ethan hesitated. His hands hovered over the final symbol as the man stepped closer. "Think, Ethan," the man said. "Every time you try to break free, you make the prison stronger. Do you really think this is any different?" Doubt crept into Ethan's mind. What if the man was right? What if his attempts to escape were only reinforcing the system? He thought of the journal, the countless notes and maps he had followed, all leading him here. Had they been left by him in another cycle, or were they just another layer of manipulation? The stone's glow intensified, pulling Ethan back to the present. He glanced at the journal one last time, the words etched into his mind, "break the cycle." He turned back to the stone and pressed the final symbol dot. The clearing erupted in light, a blinding explosion that sent shockwaves through the air. Ethan stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the ground trembled beneath his feet. The symbols on the stone burned brightly, their patterns dissolving into pure energy. Through the chaos, Ethan heard the man's voice, faint and distorted, "You think you're free, but this isn't the end." When the light faded, Ethan was lying on the forest floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The stone was gone, replaced by an empty patch of earth. The air was still, the forest quiet. For a moment, Ethan simply lay there, staring up at the sky dot. When he finally stood, he felt different. The heaviness that had followed him since entering the city was gone, replaced by a strange lightness. The forest seemed brighter, more vibrant, and the oppressive sense of being watched had vanished. But as Ethan began to walk, a question lingered in the back of his mind: what if this is just another layer? Ethan stood in the center of the clearing, the sound of the explosion of light still echoing in his mind. The air around him felt heavy with possibility, the kind of charged silence that comes just before something profound. Though the oppressive presence he had felt since entering the city was gone, he couldn't shake the sense that the cycle wasn't fully broken. The forest, no longer suffocating, seemed to watch him with a quiet expectancy dot. The symbols, the man in the suit, the stone, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle he still hadn't solved. He didn't know what he had done by activating the stone, only that something fundamental had shifted. Ethan began walking, hoping the forest might guide him to an answer. The landscape changed subtly as he moved forward. The dense trees thinned, and the ground beneath him became softer, more open. The sounds of the forest, which had been muted before, grew louder. Birds called from the treetops, and the distant sound of running water reached his ears. It was almost peaceful, almost dot. He followed the sound of the water until he came to a small stream. Its crystal-clear waters flowed lazily over moss-covered stones. Ethan knelt by the edge, cupping the cool water in his hands and splashing it over his face. When he looked down into the stream, his reflection made him pause dot. The man staring back at him was familiar, but something had changed. His features were softer, his face less lined, as if the weight of the cycle had physically aged him before now lifting. His eyes, though, seemed sharper, more vibrant, but they carried a weight of something he couldn't name. He ran a hand across his face, touching the contours of his jaw as if confirming they were his dot. Ethan pulled back from the stream, shaking his head. There was no time to dwell on his appearance. The forest stretched out before him, its pathways dappled with light. He continued walking, and as he did, the surroundings became stranger. Trees bent as if bowing in his direction, their branches parting to allow him passage. Flowers bloomed in his wake, their colors unnaturally vivid. It was as though the forest itself was responding to his presence. Finally, he reached a hill. Climbing it, he saw a breathtaking view unfold before him. Rolling golden fields stretched into the horizon, framed by distant mountains shrouded in mist. The sky was impossibly clear, a deep, endless blue. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. And yet, something about it didn't feel entirely real. Ethan sat down at the top of the hill, letting the scene wash over him. For the first time in what felt like eternity, there was peace. But even as he sat there, staring at the horizon, an idea gnawed at the back of his mind: what if this is still part of the cycle? The thought sent a shiver through him. Hadn't the man in the suit warned him that every attempt to escape only deepened his imprisonment? What if this was just another illusion, crafted to keep him complacent? The stone, the explosion of light, had it really shattered the system, or had it merely pushed him into a new layer of it? He lay back on the grass, staring at the sky as the questions swirled in his mind. He thought about everything the man in the suit had said: the prison depends on you. Ethan had dismissed those words as manipulation, but now they felt heavier, as if they carried a truth he hadn't been ready to face. Perhaps the cycle wasn't just something imposed on him. Perhaps it was something he had built around himself. The idea was terrifying, that his own mind, his own choices, had reinforced the walls of his cage. The forest grew quiet again, as if it were listening to his thoughts. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, he heard it, the whisper. It was the same whisper that had haunted him since the moment he entered the city. But this time, it was clearer, almost distinct. Ethan sat up, his pulse quickening as he scanned the horizon. The whisper didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere, a soft, insistent voice weaving through the air. "Remember who you are," it said. The same phrase he had heard before, but now it carried an urgency that gripped him. Ethan closed his eyes, focusing on the voice. He tried to block out the beauty of the scene around him, the soft breeze, the warmth of the sun on his skin. If this was part of the cycle, then it was designed to keep him here, to lull him into forgetting. He couldn't let that happen. But then another thought hit him: what if this is real? What if he had truly broken free, and his doubts were the remnants of the system's hold on him? What if, in trying to escape again, he would destroy his only chance at freedom? The contradiction was maddening. Ethan stood, his fists clenched, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He looked to the horizon one last time, searching for some clue, some sign that would tell him what to do. But there was nothing. Only the fields, the mountains, and the endless sky. The whisper faded, leaving only silence. Ethan took a deep breath, then another. He didn't know the answer. He might never know. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity: choice. He turned his back on the horizon and began walking back into the forest. Ethan walked through the forest, each step feeling more real than the last. The sound of leaves crunching under his boots was sharper now, and the coolness of the air on his skin grounded him in the present. Yet, an emptiness lingered in his chest, a hollow space where memories used to reside. Fragments of the city, the machine, and the man in the suit flickered at the edges of his mind, like distant echoes of a dream. He tried to hold on to them, but they slipped further away with every moment, dissolving into nothingness. Maybe this was the cost of breaking the cycle. Perhaps to leave, he had to leave everything behind, even himself. Ethan pushed forward. The trees thinned, revealing glimpses of a brighter world beyond. The oppressive weight of the forest seemed to lift with every step, and for the first time in days, or was it weeks, he felt the warmth of sunlight on his face. Soon, the forest opened into a wide clearing, and a hill rose gently before him. He climbed it slowly, the ground soft beneath his feet. When he reached the top, a breathtaking vista unfolded. Golden fields stretched endlessly into the horizon, their edges blending with the faint blue outline of distant mountains. The sky was vast and unbroken, painted in shades of soft pink and orange as the sun began to set. Ethan sank to the ground, the grass cool and damp beneath his hands. The beauty of the scene was undeniable, but something about it felt too perfect. It was serene, yes, but unnaturally so, like a painting crafted to evoke comfort and awe. He closed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling, but the question returned, louder than before: what if this is still part of the cycle? His chest tightened at the thought. The man in the suit had warned him that every attempt to escape only deepened the prison. Ethan didn't want to believe it, but the nagging doubt refused to fade. Had the explosion of light and the machine truly shattered the system, or had it simply shifted him to a new layer of the same trap? He looked back at the horizon. The golden fields swayed gently in the breeze, and the mountains stood steady in the distance. Everything seemed too still, too perfect, like a carefully constructed illusion designed to pacify him. Lying back in the grass, Ethan stared at the sky. The clouds drifted slowly, their shapes morphing into forms that felt almost familiar. He thought of the whispers, the journal, the flashes of memory, all the clues he'd followed to reach this point. Each one had felt like a step forward, yet now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only been walking in circles. You are the prisoner and the key. The man's voice echoed in his mind, pulling him back to that suffocating chamber. Ethan's hand clenched at the memory, his nails digging into his palms. Was the cycle truly dependent on him? Was his struggle the very thing that fed it? A soft breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint sound, a whisper. Ethan sat up sharply, scanning his surroundings. The whisper was faint, indistinct, but undeniably there. He turned his head, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Remember who you are. The words cut through the air like a blade. They were the same ones he had heard in the city, the ones that had followed him through every step of his journey. Ethan's pulse quickened as he rose to his feet. He couldn't see anyone, but the whisper persisted, growing louder. Remember who you are. Ethan pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was already inside him. His breathing grew ragged as doubt took hold again. Was this freedom, or was it another level of the cycle? Was the whisper a remnant of his captivity, or a warning from whatever was left of his true self? The whisper faded, leaving only silence behind. Ethan stood alone on the hilltop, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. If this was still the cycle, then continuing to fight might only reinforce it. But if he did nothing, if he gave up entirely, then the system had already won. He looked out at the horizon one last time, searching for some clue in the endless expanse of gold and blue. There was nothing. No answers, no signs. Only himself, standing on the precipice of uncertainty. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the silence settle over him. For the first time, he accepted that he might never find the truth. The cycle could be broken, or it could go on forever. Either way, he had made it this far. And for the first time, he felt something new. Choice. Ethan turned and began walking down the hill, leaving the golden fields behind. The forest waited ahead, its shadows stretching toward him like an open door. He didn't know where it would lead, but it didn't matter anymore. He was moving forward.